The last thing I expected at my cousin's wedding reception was to watch my stepfather's face turn white as a sheet when his boss walked up to our table. But when Mr. Henderson leaned over and whispered something in his ear, I knew my carefully guarded secret was about to come crashing down around me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The whole mess started 3 months earlier when I decided to move back to Denver after finishing my MBA at Northwestern. I'd been living in Chicago for 6 years, building something most people wouldn't believe if I told them. But coming home meant facing family again, and family meant dealing with Richard Kowalski, the man who married my mother when I was 12 and never let me forget that I wasn't his real daughter. Richard worked as a senior loan officer at Rocky Mountain Financial, one of those mid-sized banks that thought they were bigger than they actually were. He'd been there for 15 years, climbing his way up from a teller position, and he wore that modest success like a crown. Every family dinner became a lecture about fiscal responsibility. Every conversation somehow circled back to how I was wasting my life and my mother's money on what he called, quote, pipe dreams and liberal nonsense. Megan's still playing around with those little art projects of hers, he'd tell anyone who'd listen, usually while I was sitting right there. 28 years old and still doesn't have a real job, just burning through her trust fund like it grows on trees. The trust fund comment always stung because it wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't the whole truth either. My father had left me money when he died, but it wasn't the fortune Richard made it sound like. What Richard didn't know was what I'd done with that money, or how a shy art student from Denver had managed to build something extraordinary in Chicago. It started innocently enough. During my senior year at University of Colorado, I'd created a small online platform to help local artists sell their work. Just a simple website where painters, photographers, and sculptors could showcase their pieces without paying gallery fees. I called it ArtSpace Denver, and within 6 months, we had over 200 local artists signed up. But something interesting happened. Buyers started coming from outside Colorado. Then, outside the country. The platform grew, and I found myself learning about international commerce, payment processing, and digital marketing out of necessity. By the time I graduated, ArtSpace had expanded to 12 cities. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of staying in Denver and dealing with Richard's constant criticism, I moved to Chicago and threw myself completely into building the business. I lived in a studio apartment that cost more than my mother's mortgage, ate ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and worked 18-hour days. The first 2 years were brutal. I nearly went bankrupt twice, maxed out every credit card I could get, and watched my father's money disappear into server costs, legal fees, and employee salaries. Richard, of course, saw this as vindication of everything he'd ever said about me. During our weekly phone calls, he'd remind me that I should have stayed in Denver, gotten a sensible job, maybe married that nice boy from high school who now sold insurance. "You're going to end up homeless, Megan," he'd say, "and don't think you can come crawling back here when it all falls apart. Your mother and I aren't running a charity." What Richard didn't know was that by year 3, something had shifted. ArtSpace had evolved beyond just selling art. We'd developed proprietary algorithms for matching collectors with pieces they'd love. We'd created virtual reality gallery experiences, and we'd built relationships with major auction houses and museums. The platform that started as a way to help local artists had become something much bigger. By year 4, we weren't just facilitating art sales. We were predicting trends, influencing markets, and generating revenue streams I hadn't even imagined when I started. The tech companies in Silicon Valley started paying attention. So did investors from New York, London, and Tokyo. The acquisition offers started coming in during my 5th year in Chicago. Facebook wanted our user data and recommendation algorithms. Google was interested in our AR technology. Amazon saw potential in our logistics network. But the offer that changed everything came from Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm that specialized in scaling digital platforms. They didn't just want to buy ArtSpace, they wanted me to run their entire digital acquisition division. The deal they offered wasn't just about money, though there was plenty of that. It was about building something even bigger, using the model we'd created to transform how people discovered and purchased luxury goods online. The signing happened on a Tuesday morning in March. in a conference room on the 40th floor of a building that overlooked Lake Michigan. When I walked out of that meeting, I wasn't just the founder of a successful startup anymore. I was the managing director of Meridian Digital Holdings, with an equity stake that put my net worth somewhere north of $40 million. But instead of celebrating, I felt hollow. All those years of building something incredible, and the only people who mattered to me had no idea it had even happened. My mother still thought I was struggling to pay rent. Richard still made jokes about my little art hobby whenever we talked. So I made a decision that probably wasn't entirely healthy but felt necessary at the time. I decided to keep the secret. When I moved back to Denver, I rented a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, bought a used Honda Civic, and let everyone believe exactly what they'd always believed about me, that I was Megan Patterson, the dreamy art girl who never quite figured out how to make it in the real world. The deception was easier than I'd expected. My work for Meridian was entirely remote, conducted through encrypted video calls and digital signatures. My official address remained my Chicago office, my tax documents went to my accountant there, and my lifestyle in Denver was deliberately unremarkable. I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out how to bridge the gap between who I'd become and who my family thought I was. But weeks turned into months, and the lie became more comfortable than the truth. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to take particular pleasure in my apparent return to failure. At family dinners, he'd regale everyone with stories about the reality check I must have gotten in Chicago. How the real world had finally taught me the lessons he'd been trying to share all along. "I hate to say I told you so," he'd announce to anyone within earshot, usually while carving the Sunday roast. But some people have to learn the hard way that success requires discipline and practical thinking, not artistic fantasies. My mother would give me sympathetic looks across the table, clearly worried about my finances and my future. My stepbrother Jake, Richard's son from his first marriage, had started treating me with the kind of gentle condescension you'd show to a recovering addict. Even my cousin Sarah, who was getting married in June, had started asking if I needed help finding a real job before the wedding. The irony was suffocating, but I dug myself too deep to climb out easily. How do you tell people that everything they believe about you is wrong without sounding completely insane? How do you explain that while they were worried about your rent money, you were approving million-dollar acquisitions from your laptop at coffee shops in Lodo? The wedding was supposed to be my chance to start over, to maybe begin the conversation about who I'd really become. Sarah had always been more like a sister than a cousin, and I thought maybe I could tell her the truth first, use her wedding as a fresh start. But Richard had other plans. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect Colorado days that makes you remember why people move here from places with actual weather. I'd spent the previous evening at the rehearsal dinner, watching Richard hold court at the head table, regaling Sarah's future in-laws with stories about his banking expertise, and dropping not-so-subtle hints about my supposed financial struggles. "Megan's been having a tough time since she came back from Chicago," he'd announced to the entire table of 12 people, most of whom I just met. "The economy's been rough on young people, especially ones who didn't plan ahead properly. But that's what family's for, right? We all have to help each other through difficult times." Mrs. Chen, Sarah's future mother-in-law, had given me the kind of pitying smile usually reserved for injured animals. "Oh, sweetie, what kind of work are you looking for? My husband knows people in hospitality if you're interested." I'd spent the rest of that dinner pushing food around my plate and making non-committal sounds while Richard painted an increasingly detailed picture of my fictional poverty. By the time we left, half the wedding party thought I was sleeping on my mother's couch and applying for jobs at retail stores. But the wedding day itself started differently. I woke up in my apartment, the one Richard didn't know cost $4,000 a month, to 3 missed calls from my assistant in Chicago and a text that made my stomach drop. Meridian board meeting moved to today. Emergency vote on the Brisbane acquisition. Need your authorization on the $47 million transfer by 2 p.m. Eastern. The Brisbane deal was something I'd been working on for months, an Australian digital art platform that would give us access to the entire Pacific market. If the vote didn't happen today, we'd lose the opportunity to a competitor, and 18 months of negotiation would evaporate. I glanced at the clock, 9:30 a.m. Mountain Time. That gave me exactly 2.5 hours before the vote, and I was supposed to be at the church in an hour to help Sarah get ready. My laptop was at home, but the hotel where the reception was being held had a business center. I could handle the authorization there if I could slip away for 20 minutes during the cocktail hour. The ceremony was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage dress, and even Richard managed to tear up during the vows. For a few moments, watching my cousin promise to love and cherish David Chen, I almost forgot about the corporate machinations happening 3 time zones away. But then we moved to the reception at the Broadmoor Hotel, and reality came crashing back. It was 1:15 p.m., which meant 3:15 in Chicago. I had exactly 45 minutes to find the business center, log into the Meridian secure portal, and authorize a transfer that was larger than most people's lifetime earnings. The cocktail hour was in full swing when I slipped away from the main ballroom. The business center was tucked away on the second floor, behind a door marked Executive Services. I'd hoped it would be empty, but there was one other person there, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, typing furiously on one of the public computers. He looked up when I entered, and I recognized him immediately. Robert Henderson, President and CEO of Rocky Mountain Financial. Richard's boss, and according to the company directory I'd researched months ago, the man who'd hired my stepfather 15 years earlier. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'll just be another few minutes if you need to use this station." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "No problem," I replied, settling at the computer furthest from him. "Take your time." What happened next was a masterclass in compartmentalization. While Robert Henderson managed whatever crisis had pulled him away from the wedding reception, I logged into a secure portal that gave me access to more money than his entire bank processed in a quarter. The authorization screen loaded. Transfer amount, $47 million USD. Recipient, Brisbane Digital Arts. Pi Limited Purpose. Acquisition completion. Final payment. I entered my authorization codes, submitted my digital signature, and watched as $47 million moved across the Pacific Ocean with a few keystrokes. The confirmation email arrived 30 seconds later, followed immediately by a text from my assistant. Transfer confirmed. Brisbane deal officially closed. The board sends congratulations. You just bought us Australia. Quite a wedding, isn't it? Henderson said from across the room, apparently finished with his own business. Yes, I replied, quickly logging out and clearing the browser history. Sarah looks beautiful. Are you family? I'm Robert Henderson. I work with Richard Kowalski. He's mentioned having a stepdaughter. That's me, Megan Patterson. Something shifted in his expression, and I realized my mistake immediately. Patterson was my maiden name, the name on all my Meridian documentation. But at family gatherings, everyone called me Megan Kowalski, assuming I'd taken Richard's name when my mother remarried. Patterson, he repeated slowly. Megan Patterson from Meridian Digital Holdings? The blood drained from my face. There was no point in lying. Robert Henderson was the kind of man who would verify what he suspected within 24 hours anyway. Yes. I'll be damned. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with new interest. Do you have any idea how much money your company has cost my bank over the past 18 months? I'm sorry? The art market surge. Ever since platforms like yours started democratizing access to high-end pieces, our private banking clients have been pulling funds out of traditional investments to buy paintings and sculptures. We've lost approximately $12 million in managed assets to what our wealth management team calls the digital art craze. Single quote. I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. I had no idea. Of course, it's not really a complaint. Market evolution is part of the business. But it's fascinating to meet the architect of that change. He paused, clearly processing something. Richard talks about you quite differently than I would have expected. What do you mean? Well, he spent the better part of 2 years telling everyone at the office that his stepdaughter is struggling financially. Came back from Chicago with her tail between her legs, can't find steady work, that sort of thing. He's been using you as an example of why young people today lack practical financial sense. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. He doesn't know about Meridian. Clearly not. Henderson's expression had shifted from surprised to something approaching amusement. This is quite the situation, isn't it? Before I could respond, the business center door opened, and Richard himself walked in, looking harried and slightly drunk. Bob, there you are. Sarah's been looking for you. They're about to do the father-daughter dance. He noticed me then, and his expression darkened. Megan? What are you doing up here? This is a wedding, not a job fair. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Henderson looked at Richard, then at me, then back at Richard. I could practically see him calculating the social dynamics, weighing his options. Actually, Richard, Henderson said slowly, I was just having a fascinating conversation with your stepdaughter about her work. Work? Richard let out a harsh laugh. What work? She's been job hunting for 3 months without any luck. I keep telling her she needs to lower her expectations, maybe consider something in retail or food service to start building some real work experience. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. Richard, I think there might be some confusion here. No confusion at all. I know it's embarrassing to have family members who can't get their act together, but I believe in honesty. Megan's a sweet girl, but she's never had a practical bone in her body. Spends all her time on those art projects, never learned the value of $1. That's when Henderson made the decision that would change everything. Richard, he said quietly, I think you should know that Megan doesn't need our help finding work. In fact, her company processes more money in a single day than our bank handles in a month. Quote. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching panic. What are you talking about? Henderson looked at me, and I gave him a barely perceptible nod. Your stepdaughter, he said, is the managing director of Meridian Digital Holdings. She just authorized a $47 million acquisition while we've been standing here. The color drained from Richard's face so quickly I thought he might faint. The silence in that business center stretched so long I could hear the distant sound of the wedding band starting up in the ballroom below. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, while Henderson watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly fascinating social experiment. That's impossible, Richard finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been living in that tiny apartment, driving that beat-up Honda. She asked for my advice about health insurance options for unemployed people. Henderson pulled out his phone and did something that made my stomach clench. Within 30 seconds, he was showing Richard the screen. Apparently, he'd pulled up Meridian's corporate website, where my photo appeared prominently on the leadership page. Megan Patterson, Managing Director, Digital Acquisitions Division, Henderson read aloud. Previously founder and CEO of ArtSpace International, acquired by Meridian Holdings in 2023 for an undisclosed sum. He looked up at Richard. The financial press estimated that undisclosed sum at somewhere north of $60 million. Richard's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he gripped the doorframe for support. This is some kind of mistake. Some kind of joke. It's not a joke, Richard, I said quietly. It felt strange to finally speak the words aloud after months of careful deception. I've been working for Meridian since the acquisition. I manage their entire digital portfolio, 17 companies across 4 continents. But you said you were struggling. You said Chicago didn't work out. I never said Chicago didn't work out. You assumed it didn't work out, and I didn't correct you. Henderson was still studying his phone, apparently diving deeper into whatever information he could find online. This is remarkable, Richard. According to this profile in Forbes, your stepdaughter was named to their 30 under 30 feet list in the technology category. They call her the architect of the digital art revolution. Forbes? Richard's voice cracked slightly on the word. It gets better, Henderson continued, clearly enjoying himself now. There's a profile here from last month in Bloomberg Businessweek about her acquisition strategy. Listen to this. Patterson's unique approach to identifying and scaling digital platforms has generated over $200 million in revenue for Meridian in just 18 months. Her next target appears to be the European luxury goods market, where industry insiders expect her to make several major acquisitions before year-end. Richard looked at me like I'd grown a second head. $200 million? The European expansion is still in early planning stages, I said, because apparently my brain had decided that now was an appropriate time for business updates. We're looking at platforms in Milan and Paris, but the regulatory environment is more complex than Australia. Australia? Richard repeated weakly. The Brisbane acquisition I just closed gives us access to the entire Pacific Rim market. It was actually Henderson's bank that processed part of the due diligence funding 6 months ago, though I'm sure he didn't make the connection at the time. Henderson's expression shifted to something approaching respect. That $47 million transfer from the Morrison Sterling account, that was you? Through a subsidiary, yes. Meridian prefers to keep its acquisition funding streams diversified across multiple institutions. $47 million, Richard said, and this time it wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man's worldview crumbling in real time. What happened next was perhaps the most uncomfortable 60 seconds of my adult life. Richard just stared at me, processing the complete demolition of everything he thought he knew about his stepdaughter. His face cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and what looked like genuine hurt. Why, he finally asked. Why let me think you were failing? Why let me lecture you about fiscal responsibility and finding a real job? Do you have any idea how many people I told about your situation? The honest answer was complicated, involving years of feeling diminished and dismissed, of being treated like a financial burden and a cautionary tale. But standing there in that business center, with Henderson watching our family drama unfold, I realized the simple truth was much more damaging. Because you never asked what I was actually doing, I said. In 3 months of dinners and phone calls, you never once asked about my work, my life in Chicago, or what I'd accomplished. You just assumed I'd failed and started treating me like a charity case. But you played along. You let me believe. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, what you'd always believed about me. Henderson cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps I should give you two some privacy to discuss this. No, Richard said quickly. No, please stay. I need to understand this. He turned back to me. The apartment, the car, asking about health insurance. The apartment is a corporate rental. The car belongs to the company's Denver office. I didn't want to deal with buying something when I wasn't sure how long I'd be staying. And I asked about health insurance because Meridian's plan has different coverage requirements in different states. I needed to understand the local options for our employees. Employees? He repeated. How many employees? Globally, about 400. In the Denver office, just 12, but we're expanding. Henderson looked genuinely impressed. You have a Denver office? Reno District. We opened it last month to handle our Rocky Mountain expansion. Colorado's becoming a major hub for digital art collectors, partly because of the tech industry growth in Boulder and Fort Collins. Richard sat down heavily in one of the business center chairs. 400 employees. Richard, Henderson said gently, I think you might want to know that your stepdaughter's company is actually one of our bank's largest commercial clients. The Denver office alone maintains accounts worth approximately $8 million. If Richard had looked pale before, he now looked positively gray. $8 million. Their payroll account processes about $200,000 every 2 weeks. Commercial lending has been hoping to expand the relationship. We've been trying to schedule a meeting with their local management team for months. I felt a perverse urge to laugh. That would be me. I'm part of the local management team. Henderson was pulling up something else on his phone, and his expression shifted from impressed to something approaching awe. Richard, I'm looking at the corporate filings here. Your stepdaughter isn't just an employee, she owns 18% of Meridian Digital Holdings. What does that mean? Richard asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. At their current valuation, which according to this TechCrunch article from last week is approximately $400 million. Henderson paused, apparently doing mental math. That means Megan's personal stake in the company is worth roughly $72 million. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of a man confronting the complete inversion of his understanding of reality. Richard had spent months positioning himself as the successful, practical adult, offering guidance to his struggling stepdaughter. Now he was learning that his stepdaughter was worth more money than he would earn in several lifetimes. $72 million, he whispered. Of course, that's just her equity stake, Henderson continued, apparently committed to thoroughly destroying Richard's remaining illusions. Her salary and bonuses would be separate. Managing directors at firms like Meridian typically earn. Please stop, Richard interrupted. Please just stop. But Henderson wasn't finished. Actually, Richard, there's something else you should probably know. Something that makes this situation even more interesting. Richard looked like a man being offered the chance to be shot or hanged. What? Rocky Mountain Financial, our bank. We've been acquired. What do you mean, acquired? The paperwork came through yesterday. We've been purchased by a larger financial services company. The deal's been in the works for 6 months, but they just announced it to senior management. Richard's face, already pale, somehow managed to lose even more color. Who bought us? Henderson smiled, and it wasn't entirely kind. Meridian Holdings. The sound Richard made wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a whimper. It was the sound of a man realizing that the person he'd been condescending to for months was now, technically speaking, his boss's boss's boss. That means, Henderson continued with evident satisfaction, that your stepdaughter now owns the company that holds your mortgage, your car loan, and your retirement account. Richard looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part terror, part respect, and part something that might have been pride, though it was hard to tell through the overwhelming shock. Megan, he said quietly, I think we need to talk. The walk back to the reception felt like crossing a minefield. Richard moved beside me in stunned silence, while Henderson had excused himself to make some calls. Apparently owning a bank required immediate attention even during wedding receptions. The hallway seemed endless, filled with the distant sounds of celebration that now felt like they belonged to a different universe. How long have you known? Richard asked suddenly, stopping just outside the ballroom doors. Know what? About the bank acquisition. About becoming He struggled with the words, my employer. The Rocky Mountain deal closed yesterday morning. I found out when I approved the final paperwork on Thursday. I paused, watching his face process this information. I had no idea you worked there when we first started exploring Colorado banking acquisitions 6 months ago. 6 months. He rubbed his forehead like he was fighting a headache. You've been planning to buy my bank for 6 months. Not your bank specifically. We identified 12 potential acquisition targets in the Rocky Mountain region. Your bank just happened to have the best commercial lending portfolio and the strongest digital infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. While Richard had been lecturing me about financial planning, I'd been evaluating the institution that employed him like a piece on a chessboard. What happens now, he asked. Do I get fired? Do you restructure the entire company out of spite? The question caught me off guard, partly because it revealed how fundamentally he still misunderstood me. Richard, I don't make vindictive business decisions. Rocky Mountain Financial was acquired because it's profitable and well-managed. Henderson's built a solid operation there. But surely you're going to want changes. The only changes we're implementing are technology upgrades and expanded lending capabilities. Henderson stays as CEO, the staff keeps their jobs, and the daily operations continue exactly as they have been. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been disappointment. So nothing changes for me? Should something change? I don't know. I spent 3 months telling everyone at work that my stepdaughter was a financial disaster. I used you as an example of what happens when people don't plan for the future. Half the loan department thinks you're applying for jobs at coffee shops. Quote, the weight of his humiliation was starting to sink in, and despite everything, I felt a stab of sympathy for him. What did you tell them exactly? That you'd moved back from Chicago because your art business failed. That you were living paycheck to paycheck. Couldn't afford decent housing, needed help understanding basic financial concepts. He paused, looking miserable. I told Henderson last month that you were a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing impractical dreams. When you requested that meeting with him? Richard's eyes widened. You know about that? All department heads' requests for executive meetings cross my desk now. Henderson forwarded your email asking to discuss your stepdaughter's employment prospects and whether the bank had any entry-level positions available. The color drained from his face again. You saw that email? I saw it, Richard. I saw you asking your boss to give me a job out of pity, describing me as someone who'd learned the hard way that, quote, artistic pursuits don't pay the bills, and needed guidance toward more realistic career goals. I was trying to help. You were trying to prove a point. You wanted to rescue me from my own poor decisions, to show me that you'd been right all along about practical versus impractical life choices. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of the wedding band playing something slow and romantic in the ballroom behind us. Through the glass doors, I could see Sarah dancing with her new husband, surrounded by family and friends who had no idea that a corporate drama worthy of a business school case study was playing out in the hallway. I need to understand something, Richard said finally. The apartment, the car, the questions about health insurance. You really did all of that just to maintain the illusion that I was right about you. Not to maintain an illusion, to avoid a confrontation I wasn't ready to have. What kind of confrontation? The kind where I'd have to explain that while you were worrying about my financial future, I was building something bigger than you could imagine. The kind where I'd have to tell you that your lectures about fiscal responsibility were coming from someone who makes less in a year than I spend on office rent. The harshness of my own words surprised me, but they'd been building for months. Richard stepped back slightly as if I'd physically struck him. I never meant to diminish what you were doing, he said quietly, but you did diminish it. You dismissed it completely. You never asked about my work, my goals, or what I'd learned in Chicago. You just assumed I'd failed and appointed yourself my financial advisor. Because I cared about you. Because I wanted you to succeed. No, Richard. You wanted me to succeed on your terms, in ways you could understand and approve of. When I didn't fit into your definition of success, you decided I must be failing. A group of wedding guests emerged from the ballroom, laughing and chatting as they headed toward the restrooms. We stepped aside to let them pass, both of us suddenly aware that we were having this conversation in a very public space. We should go back inside, I said. Sarah's going to wonder where we disappeared to. Not yet. Richard's voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before. I need to know what this means for us. For the family. What do you want it to mean? I want to understand how I got this so wrong. I want to know how to fix it. The honest answer was that I wasn't sure it could be fixed, at least not easily. The revelations of the past hour had exposed something deeper than simple misunderstanding. They'd revealed a fundamental disconnect in how we saw each other and our places in the world. Richard, for the past 3 months, every conversation we've had has been built on the assumption that you were the successful adult and I was the struggling child who needed guidance. Every dinner, every phone call, every piece of advice was delivered from that position. I know, and I was wrong. It's not just that you were wrong about the facts, you were wrong about the dynamic. You never considered that I might have something to teach you, or that my experiences might be valuable, or that my perspective might be worth hearing. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications of what I was saying. What you're telling me, he said slowly, is that even if you hadn't been successful, the way I treated you would have been wrong. Now you're getting it. Because I never asked what you thought, what you'd learned, what your goals were, I just assumed I knew better. Right. Another silence, this one less charged, but more thoughtful. The meeting with Henderson, Richard said eventually. The one where I asked him to consider hiring you. You could have stopped that. You could have told me the truth before I humiliated myself. I could have, but honestly, I was curious to see how far you'd take it. That's cold, Megan. Maybe. But you'd spent weeks telling me I needed to be more realistic about my prospects, more humble about my abilities. I wanted to see what your version of helping me looked like. And now you know. Now I know. Richard leaned against the wall, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Henderson's never going to let me forget this. The entire senior staff is going to know that I spent months complaining about my stepdaughter's financial irresponsibility to the woman who now owns the bank. Probably not. What do you mean? Henderson's a professional. He's not going to gossip about his new owner's family dynamics. And the acquisition announcement won't mention my personal connections to any of the employees. Richard looked at me with something approaching hope. You're not going to tell anyone? I'm not going to tell anyone at your work, no. What you choose to tell Mom, Jake, and the rest of the family is up to you. What would you prefer I tell them? It was a good question, and one I hadn't fully considered until that moment. The secret I'd been keeping had given me a strange kind of power, but it had also isolated me from the people who mattered most. I'd prefer you tell them the truth, I said finally, but I'd also prefer you let me tell them myself, in my own time, in my own way. And until then, nothing changes. I'm still Megan, you're still Richard, and we're still family trying to figure out how to understand each other. He nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are you happy? With all of this success, all this money and responsibility, are you actually happy? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. Standing there in that hotel hallway, having just revealed the secret I'd been carrying for months, I realized I didn't have a simple answer. I'm proud of what I've built, I said carefully, but happiness is more complicated than success. What would make you happy? Having conversations like this one, but without needing a corporate acquisition to make them happen. Richard managed a small, sad smile. That might be the most expensive family therapy session in history. Despite everything, I found myself smiling back. Probably not. You should see what some of our clients spend on corporate consulting. Don't tell me. I'm not sure my ego can handle any more revelations today. Quote. The ballroom doors opened again, and this time it was my mother who emerged, looking around with the slightly frantic expression of someone who'd been searching for missing family members. There you are, she called out, hurrying toward us. Sarah's about to throw the bouquet. She specifically asked for you to be there, Megan. I looked at Richard, and he nodded toward the ballroom. We should go back in. This is Sarah's day. Yes, I agreed, it is. But as we walked back toward the celebration, both of us knew that something fundamental had shifted. The conversation we'd just had couldn't be undone, and the revelations couldn't be forgotten. For better or worse, we were going to have to learn how to be family all over again, this time with a more honest understanding of who we actually were. The bouquet toss was a disaster, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Sarah launched her flowers with the enthusiasm of a quarterback throwing a Hail Mary pass, and they sailed directly into the crystal chandelier above the dance floor. The resulting crash of falling glass and orchids sent 24 single women scrambling for cover, and provided exactly the kind of distraction I needed to slip back into the reception without drawing attention to my red-rimmed eyes. Richard and I had managed to compose ourselves during the walk back to the ballroom, but the emotional weight of our conversation hung between us like a thick fog. We found our assigned table. Number 7, strategically positioned far enough from the head table to avoid the spotlight but close enough to hear the speeches. My mother was already seated, chatting with David's aunt about something involving grandchildren and retirement plans. Where have you two been? She asked as we sat down. You missed the father-daughter dance. And Richard, your face looks terrible. Are you feeling all right? Just needed some air, Richard managed, loosening his tie slightly. Wedding receptions can be overwhelming. Mom turned her attention to me, and I could see her taking inventory of my appearance with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 28 years reading my emotional states. Honey, you look upset. Did something happen? Before I could answer, Henderson appeared at our table, looking considerably more relaxed than he had in the business center. Richard, I wanted to apologize for monopolizing your time earlier. I hope I didn't cause any family drama with my enthusiasm about meeting your stepdaughter. No drama at all, Richard replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor. Just interesting to learn more about Megan's work. Her work? Mom's eyebrows rose. What kind of work? I thought you were still job searching, sweetheart. The moment stretched uncomfortably as Richard and I exchanged glances. Henderson, oblivious to the family dynamics he'd just stepped into, smiled broadly at my mother. Mrs. Kowalski, you must be incredibly proud. Your daughter has built one of the most successful digital platforms in the country. We've been trying to expand our business relationship with her company for months. My daughter? Mom looked confused. But Megan doesn't have company. She just moved back from Chicago because things didn't work out there. Henderson's expression shifted as he realized he'd walked into something more complicated than a simple family introduction. I see. Well, perhaps I misunderstood the situation. No, I said quietly, you understood perfectly. Mom, there are some things about Chicago that I haven't told you. The next 20 minutes were perhaps the most surreal of my life. Sitting at table 7, with the wedding reception continuing around us, I found myself explaining 6 years of my life to my mother, while Richard sat in uncomfortable silence, and Henderson made polite excuses about needing to check on other guests. Mom's reactions followed a predictable pattern: disbelief, confusion, hurt at being kept in the dark, and finally a kind of maternal pride that made my chest tight with emotion. But it was her questions that surprised me. So when you called last month asking about local health insurance options, she said, you weren't worried about affording coverage? I was trying to understand the Colorado market for our employees. We were opening the Denver office, and I needed to research benefit packages. And when you asked Richard for advice about retirement planning? I glanced at Richard, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I was curious about his perspective on traditional investment strategies versus the digital asset portfolios we were recommending to our clients. You were testing him, Mom said, and it wasn't a question. Not testing exactly, more like trying to understand his expertise. And what did you conclude about his expertise? Quote, it was a dangerous question, loaded with potential for family destruction. I chose my words carefully. I concluded that he has a solid understanding of conventional financial planning, but limited experience with emerging market technologies. Richard let out a sound that might have been relief or laughter. That's the most diplomatic way anyone's ever told me I don't know what I'm talking about. You know what you're talking about, Richard. You just don't know what I'm talking about, and I didn't give you the opportunity to learn. Mom was still processing the implications. Megan, when you said you were struggling in Chicago, what exactly did you mean? I never said I was struggling. I said Chicago was challenging, which it was. Building a company from nothing while learning how to manage employees, navigate regulations, and develop new technologies. That was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But you let us think. I let you think what you wanted to think. When I came home and everyone assumed I'd failed, it was easier to go along with that assumption than to explain what had actually happened. Why? It was the question I had been avoiding, even in my own mind, because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, because the success felt fragile and improbable, and I was worried that talking about it would somehow make it disappear. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Sweetheart, do you really think so little of us? Do you think we wouldn't celebrate your success? I think you would celebrate it now that you know it's real. But 6 months ago, if I'd come home and announced that I'd sold my company for $60 million and been hired to run digital acquisitions for a major investment firm, what would you have said? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mom would have worried I was having some kind of breakdown. Richard would have assumed I was delusional or lying. Even Sarah, who knew me better than anyone, would have suggested I see a therapist. The thing is, I continued, even I didn't believe it was real for the first few months. I kept waiting for someone to tell me there had been a mistake, that they'd confused me with someone who actually knew what they were doing. Imposter syndrome, Richard said quietly. That's what they call it in business psychology, the feeling that your success is undeserved or accidental. I looked at him with surprise. You know about imposter syndrome? Quote, I have been reading about it since I got promoted to senior loan officer. Turns out a lot of successful people struggle with feeling like frauds. He paused. I just never imagined it might apply to someone as successful as you. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone tapping a microphone. Sarah's new father-in-law was preparing to give a speech, and the ballroom gradually quieted as guests turned their attention to the head table. Family, he began, is about more than blood relations or marriage certificates. It's about the people who support us, challenge us, and help us become the best versions of ourselves. His words hit me with unexpected force. I glanced around our table, at Mom, who was still holding my hand, at Richard, who was watching me with a mixture of respect and bewilderment, at the empty chair where Henderson had been sitting before he'd inadvertently triggered the most honest conversation our family had ever had. Sometimes, the speaker continued, the people we think we know best are the ones who surprise us most. Tonight, we celebrate not just Sarah and David's union, but the ongoing discovery of who we really are and who we can become together. As the applause died down and the evening moved toward its natural conclusion, I realized that the secret I'd been keeping had never really been about money or business success. It had been about identity, about who I was versus who my family thought I was, and whether those two versions could coexist. The answer, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about choosing between them. It was about finding a way to be fully myself within the context of the relationships that mattered most. "Megan," Richard said as the band started playing again and guests began moving back to the dance floor, "I have a confession to make." "Another one?" "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about me never asking about your work or your goals. The truth is, I was afraid to ask." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that you were doing something I wouldn't understand, something that would make me feel stupid or irrelevant. It was easier to assume you were struggling than to admit I might not be qualified to give you advice." The honesty in his voice was disarming. "Richard, you don't have to understand my work to have a relationship with me." "Don't I? Look at tonight. The moment I learned what you actually do, everything changed. The way I see you, the way you see me, even the way Henderson sees our family. It all changed because of information I should have had months ago. Not because of the information itself, because of how we've all been communicating with each other." Mom squeezed my hand. "What your stepfather is trying to say, and what I'm trying to understand, is how we move forward from here. How do we have a normal family relationship when there's this enormous disparity in our circumstances?" It was a fair question, and one that didn't have an easy answer. The truth was that my success had created a gap that couldn't be bridged by good intentions alone. But maybe, I thought, it didn't need to be bridged. Maybe it just needed to be acknowledged and navigated honestly. "We start by being honest about who we are," I said, "all of us. And we stop pretending that success or money or professional achievement is the most important thing about a person." "Easy to say when you're the one with the money," Richard pointed out, though his tone was gentle rather than bitter. "You're right. It is easier for me to say that. But the alternative is letting money become the defining factor in all our relationships. And I don't want that." As if summoned by our conversation, Henderson reappeared at our table, this time with a brandy in his hand and a slightly sheepish expression. "I owe all of you an apology," he said. "I realize I may have inadvertently created some family drama this evening." "Actually," Mom said, standing up and smoothing her dress, "I think you may have solved some family drama this evening. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go dance with my daughter. Both of my daughters, actually. I need to congratulate Sarah before she disappears on her honeymoon." As Mom walked toward the dance floor, Richard and Henderson found themselves alone with me, creating an odd triangle of corporate hierarchy and family relationships. "Sir," Richard said to Henderson, "about those things I said about Megan at the office." "What things?" Henderson replied with a perfectly straight face. "I don't recall any specific conversations about your stepdaughter's employment status." Richard's relief was visible. "Thank you. However," Henderson continued, "I do think we should discuss expanding our corporate services division. It seems we have some expertise we've been underutilizing." I looked at both of them and realized that the evening had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It hadn't just revealed my secret. It had created new possibilities for all of us to be honest about who we were and what we wanted from each other. The music was still playing, Sarah was still glowing with newlywed happiness, and somewhere in the hotel's executive offices, paperwork was being filed that would officially make me the owner of the bank that held my stepfather's mortgage. But for the first time in months, those facts felt less important than the simple truth that we were family, in all our complicated, imperfect, surprising glory. And maybe, I thought as I watched Mom drag Sarah onto the dance floor while still wearing her wedding dress, that was enough. 3 weeks after Sarah's wedding, I was sitting in my real office, the corner suite on the 15th floor of the Denver Tech Center building, when my assistant knocked on the door with an expression I'd never seen before. "There's a Richard Kowalski here to see you," she said carefully. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he's your stepfather." I'd been wondering when this moment would come. Since the wedding, our family had settled into an odd new rhythm of cautious honesty, but Richard and I hadn't spoken alone. Our conversations had been limited to polite exchanges during Sunday dinners, both of us dancing around the enormous elephant that now lived permanently in the room. "Send him in, Jessica, and could you bring coffee? 2 cups. Richard entered my office looking like a man visiting a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. His eyes swept across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains, the abstract art pieces that had cost more than his annual salary, and the dual monitor setup where I'd been reviewing acquisition targets in Berlin. "This is where you work," he said, and it wasn't a question. "This is where I work." He took the seat across from my desk, accepting the coffee Jessica brought with a quiet thank you. For several minutes, we sat in silence, drinking our coffee and acknowledging the surreal nature of the situation. "I came here to apologize," he said finally. "Not just for the wedding, but for everything. For 3 months of treating you like a charity case. For 18 months of using you as an example of poor life choices. For 15 years of assuming I knew what was best for you." "Richard, let me finish, please." He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the wedding. About why I reacted the way I did to your success. Why I was so invested in believing you'd failed." I waited, sensing this was something he needed to work through out loud. "The truth is, your success threatens something fundamental about how I see myself. I've spent my entire adult life building what I thought was a respectable career, providing for my family, being the responsible one who makes practical decisions. When you came back from Chicago, it felt like validation that my approach to life was correct. And now? Now I realize that my approach to life is just one approach. Not the only one, not necessarily the best one, just the one that worked for me in my circumstances." The honesty in his voice was startling. This wasn't Richard who lectured about fiscal responsibility or dismissed artistic pursuits as impractical. "There's something else," he continued. "Something I need to tell you about Henderson and the bank." My stomach tightened. What about Henderson and the bank? Yesterday he called me into his office. Not for a disciplinary meeting or anything like that, but to discuss my role in the company going forward. "What kind of discussion?" "Apparently, your acquisition team has been reviewing all the senior staff files as part of the integration process. Henderson wanted to know if I'd be interested in heading up a new division focused on small business lending to creative industries." I felt my eyebrows rise. Creative industries? Art galleries, design studios, independent music venues, that sort of thing. According to Henderson, it's a market segment the bank has never properly served, but one that's growing rapidly in the Denver area. "And you said?" "I said I'd need to learn a lot about industries I've never worked with before, industries I've spent years dismissing as financially unstable." Richard pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on my desk. Henderson gave me some preliminary research to review. Market analysis, demographic studies, revenue projections for creative businesses in Colorado. I opened the folder and immediately recognized the formatting. This wasn't Henderson's work. This was a Meridian research brief, the kind my team produced when we were evaluating new market opportunities. "Richard, this research came from my department." "I know." "You knew?" Henderson told me. He said that Meridian had identified creative industry lending as an untapped opportunity, and that the previous owners of Rocky Mountain Financial had been too conservative to pursue it. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. "So you're being offered a position that was created based on research I commissioned?" "Yes." "And how do you feel about that?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains. "Honestly, terrified. Excited, confused, grateful. All at the same time." "Terrified of what?" "Of failing, of discovering that I'm not as good at my job as I thought I was, of having to ask my stepdaughter for business advice, because she understands these markets better than I do." The vulnerability in his admission was striking. This was a side of Richard I'd never seen, uncertain, willing to acknowledge his limitations, open to learning from someone he'd previously dismissed. And excited about what? About the possibility of doing something new, about working with people who see the world differently than I do, maybe understanding why you chose the path you chose. I closed the research folder and looked at him directly. "Richard, I need you to understand something. If you take this position, it has to be because you want to do the work, not because you feel obligated to accept it, or because you think it will improve our relationship." "I know." "Do you? Because the dynamic between us is already complicated enough without adding professional obligations to the mix." You're worried I might expect special treatment because we're family. I'm worried about a lot of things. I'm worried you might expect special treatment, or that other employees might think you're getting special treatment, or that our personal relationship might influence business decisions in ways that aren't healthy for either of us. Richard nodded slowly. Those are all valid concerns. Henderson mentioned that if I accept the position, I'd be reporting to someone other than him to avoid any appearance of conflicts related to the ownership structure. That's smart. He also mentioned that my performance would be evaluated using the same metrics as any other department head, and that family relationships wouldn't be a factor in compensation or advancement decisions. Also smart. So the question becomes whether I'm willing to risk failing at something new in full view of my stepdaughter who happens to own the company. Quote, I found myself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. When you put it that way, it does sound pretty terrifying. It is terrifying, but it's also the first professional opportunity I've been excited about in years. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us contemplating the strange turn our relationship had taken. 3 weeks ago, Richard had been lecturing me about financial responsibility. Now he was considering whether to accept a job created by research I'd commissioned, working in an industry he'd previously dismissed. Can I ask you something? I said eventually. Of course. What changed your mind about creative industries? Because 3 months ago, you would have described this job opportunity as exactly the kind of impractical nonsense that leads to financial ruin. Richard laughed, and it was the first genuinely relaxed sound I'd heard from him since the wedding. 3 months ago, I thought creative industries were for people who couldn't succeed in real business. Now I know that creative industries can generate more revenue than traditional businesses, employ hundreds of people, and create products that change how entire markets operate. Because you've been reading the research. Because I've been reading the research, yes. But also because I've been thinking about what you built and how you built it, and what that says about the relationship between creativity and business success. And what does it say? It says I've been wrong about a lot of things for a very long time. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications for our relationship and our family dynamics. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. Conference call with London office in 10 minutes. The Milan acquisition just got complicated. I need to take a call, I said apologetically. International crisis management. Of course. Richard stood up, gathering his coffee cup and the research folder. I should get back to work anyway. He paused at the door, turning back to face me. Megan, regardless of what I decide about this job opportunity, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just proud of your success, but proud of how you handled all of this. The secrecy, the revelation, the aftermath. You've been more gracious about my ignorance than I deserved. Richard, we're family. Grace is part of the job description. Even so, thank you. Quote, after he left, I had 10 minutes before my call with London to process what had just happened. Richard wasn't just apologizing for his assumptions about my career. He was reconsidering his entire worldview about what constituted legitimate work, practical decision-making, and professional success. The irony wasn't lost on me that the research he was now studying with such interest was research I'd ordered months before I knew he worked at Rocky Mountain Financial. We'd been operating in parallel universes, both of us making decisions that would affect the other without knowing it. My phone rang, pulling me back to the present moment and the crisis in Milan that needed my immediate attention. As I answered the call and shifted into problem-solving mode, I reflected on how strange life had become since the wedding. I was still the same person who'd moved back to Denver 6 months ago, still the same person who'd built art space from nothing in a Chicago studio apartment. But now I was also someone whose family knew the truth about what I'd accomplished. Someone whose stepfather was considering a career change based on research I'd commissioned. Someone who had to navigate the complex intersection of family relationships and corporate ownership. It wasn't easier than keeping the secret. In some ways it was harder. But it was honest. And after months of careful deception, honesty felt like a luxury I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The call with London stretched longer than expected. The Milan situation involved regulatory complications that would require several more hours of my attention. But as I worked through the details with my team, coordinating solutions across 3 time zones, I found myself thinking about Richard's question. What has changed my mind about telling the truth? What had finally convinced me that honesty was worth the complications it would create? The answer, I realized, wasn't that the wedding had forced my hand, or that Henderson had accidentally revealed my secret. The answer was that keeping the secret had become more exhausting than telling the truth, and I'd finally reached the point where I was willing to risk the complications of being known, rather than continue to bear the isolation of being misunderstood. It wasn't a perfect solution. There would be ongoing challenges, ongoing adjustments, ongoing conversations about how to balance family relationships with professional realities. But it was real. And after 6 years of building something extraordinary while feeling like no one who mattered to me truly understood what I'd accomplished, it really felt like enough. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Rocky Mountain Financial, waiting for Richard to finish his presentation to the board of directors. Through the glass conference room walls, I could see him gesturing enthusiastically at a projection screen, explaining market penetration strategies for Denver's creative economy to a room of executives who 6 months earlier wouldn't have believed such a market existed. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. The man who'd once lectured me about the impracticality of artistic pursuits was now passionately advocating for a $60 million lending initiative targeting exactly those pursuits. "He's really found his calling, hasn't he?" Henderson said, joining me by the windows. "I've never seen him this engaged with his work." "How's the division performing?" "Beyond our projections. We've approved 42 loans in 5 months, totaling $8.7 million, with a default rate of less than 2%. The creative business owners are actually more reliable borrowers than our traditional small business clients." I watched Richard point to a chart showing revenue growth among his portfolio companies. I have to admit, I didn't expect him to take it naturally. Neither did I, but it turns out your stepfather has excellent instincts for identifying viable creative enterprises. He just needed to learn how to recognize the business fundamentals underneath the artistic vision. The presentation concluded, and Richard emerged from the conference room looking both exhausted and exhilarated. When he spotted me in the lobby, his face lit up with the kind of genuine smile I'd rarely seen from him. "How did it go?" I asked as he approached. "They approved the expansion proposal. We're opening a dedicated creative industries branch in Boulder next quarter, and they want me to develop similar programs for our branches in Fort Collins and Colorado Springs." "Congratulations, that's a huge endorsement of your work." "It's a huge endorsement of your research," he corrected. "Every recommendation I made there was based on the market analysis your team provided." We walked out of the bank together, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and downtown Denver bustled with the energy of a city that had fully embraced its transformation from cowtown to tech hub. "Richard, can I ask you something personal?" "Everything about our relationship is personal now." "Are you happy?" "With the job? With how things turned out? With knowing the truth about what I do?" He considered the question carefully, something I'd noticed he did more often since our relationship had become honest. "Happiness is complicated," he said finally. "I'm proud of the work I'm doing now. I'm excited about the businesses we're helping to grow. I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn something completely new at this stage of my career. But I'm also humbled in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable. Every day, I work with people who see the world the way you always have. People who believe that creativity and business success aren't mutually exclusive. People who take risks on ideas that seem impossible until they work." We reached the corner where our paths diverged, his toward the parking garage, mine toward my office building. "The hardest part," he continued, "isn't learning new business concepts or understanding different industries. It's accepting that I was wrong about you for so long, and wondering what other things I might be wrong about. Being wrong isn't a character flaw, Richard. Being unwilling to admit you're wrong is. When did you become so wise about human psychology?" "When I spent 6 years building a business, while pretending to be someone I wasn't. You learn a lot about people when you're constantly managing the gap between perception and reality." Richard laughed, and the sound carried none of the tension that had defined our interactions for so many years. "Your mother thinks we should write a book about all this. How corporate acquisition saved our family, or something equally ridiculous." Mom's been reading too many business memoirs. Actually, she's been reading articles about you. Did you know there was a piece in the Harvard Business Review last month about your acquisition strategy? I hadn't known, though I wasn't surprised. The business press had been paying increasing attention to Meridian's approach to scaling digital platforms. What did it say? That you've revolutionized how investment firms think about creative industries. That your model for identifying and developing artistic platforms has generated more consistent returns than traditional tech investments. And how do you feel about being related to someone who's revolutionizing investment strategies? Proud, intimidated, slightly bewildered, he paused. Grateful. Grateful for what? For the reminder that there are many ways to be successful, many ways to contribute value to the world. For the opportunity to work with people I never would have understood before. For learning that my stepdaughter is extraordinary in ways I was too stubborn to recognize. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a call from Jessica. I should take this, I said apologetically. Probably another international crisis that needs immediate attention. Of course, the global digital art market never sleeps. But as I answered the call, Richard didn't walk away. He waited, listening to my half of a conversation about licensing agreements in Tokyo and regulatory compliance in Singapore. Watching me manage complexities he was still learning to understand. When I hung up, he shook his head with something that looked like amazement. What? I asked. 6 months ago, I thought your biggest professional challenge was figuring out how to afford health insurance. Now I'm listening to you resolve international business disputes worth millions of dollars. 6 months ago, you weren't wrong to be concerned about my health insurance situation. I really was researching Colorado options. But not for yourself. Not for myself, no? We stood there for a moment, both of us reflecting on how much had changed since that awkward conversation at Sarah's wedding reception. Megan, there's something I want to tell you, something I should have said months ago. What's that? I'm sorry it took a corporate acquisition for me to see who you really are. I'm sorry I was so invested in my own perspective that I never bothered to understand yours. And I'm sorry that you felt like you had to hide your success from the people who should have been celebrating it all along. The apology was more comprehensive than anything he'd offered before, and it carried the weight of genuine understanding rather than just polite regret. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. I also want you to know that I understand now why you kept the secret as long as you did. The gap between who you were and who we thought you were, that must have felt impossible to bridge. It did feel impossible, but it turns out it wasn't actually impossible, just difficult and uncomfortable and worth doing anyway. Worth it how? Worth it because now we can have conversations like this one. Worth it because you're doing work that excites you instead of work that just pays the bills. Worth it because our family is built on truth instead of assumptions. Richard nodded slowly, even if the truth is more complicated than the assumptions were. Especially because the truth is more complicated. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from my assistant reminding me about a video conference with potential investors in Sao Paulo. I really do need to get back to work, I said. But Richard, thank you for coming by today. For sharing the good news about the expansion, for being honest about how all this has affected you. Thank you for creating the opportunity in the first place, even if you didn't know you were doing it. Especially because I didn't know I was doing it. As we parted ways, I found myself thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought us to this point. A year ago, Richard and I could barely have a civil conversation about my future. Today, we were business colleagues, family members, and something approaching friends. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward. It had required confronting uncomfortable truths, abandoning long-held assumptions, and learning to see each other as complex human beings, rather than simple archetypes. But as I walked back to my office, preparing to spend the evening negotiating deals that would affect thousands of artists and millions of dollars, I realized that the most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't the money or the professional recognition, or even the personal satisfaction of building something extraordinary. The most valuable thing was the knowledge that it was possible to be fully known by the people who mattered most, to be seen and understood and valued for who I actually was rather than who others thought I should be. It had taken a corporate acquisition, a wedding reception revelation, and 6 months of careful relationship reconstruction to get there. But it had been worth every complicated, uncomfortable, transformative moment. And that, I thought, as I entered my building and prepared to spend another evening changing the world one digital platform at a time, was the kind of success that no amount of money could buy. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.